Mono-Pluralism, the epitome of a Berdyaev hedge. Francis Berger. About a month ago, I suggested that Nikolai Berdyaev's metaphysical quest should have led him to non-omnigod and pluralism. On rereading Chapter 5 of The Meaning of the Creative Act, I revisited the closest Berdyaev seems to have come to realizing that true creativity within creation makes pluralism a necessity. Bold added.
Abstract metaphysical and mystical monism shuts out the possibility of a creative act, either in God or in the world. The creative act presupposes a mono-pluralism, that is the existence of a multitude of free and independent beings, in other words, a concrete all-oneness.
The paragraph above epitomizes what I now call the Berdyaev hedge, the seeming inability to short something metaphysically without covering and ensuring that short against loss with a presumably fail-safe long. Pluralism must be the bedrock of creation, but pluralism must possess the oxymoron quality of also being mono. There simply must be a multitude of free and independent beings, yet this multitude of free and independent beings also belong to some kind of concrete oneness. Berdyaev continues.
The question is not whether the world and man are outside divinity, but whether every person, every being, has free and independent existence. The transcendence of divinity may be accepted only in the sense that the individuality of every personality cannot disappear and be dissolved into divinity. The free and independent being of the personality unites with God but does not disappear in him. Dissolution presupposes a non-personal God, free union presupposes that God is personal.
Berdyaev is clear that his concept of concrete oneness to which the multitude of free and independent beings belongs is not the sort of dissolution unity the oneness religions promote. Fine, but what exactly is the concrete oneness to which he alludes?
The personal God is the triune God, the three persons of the Divine Trinity. Only with the persons of the Divine Trinity is personal communion and union possible. A Unitarian God is non-personal. To the first God, about whom Eckhart taught, nothing personal applies. In the religious consciousness of India, divinity has not yet revealed the trinity of his persons to the world, that is a lower degree of revelation. In Christianity, divinity has already shown his triune face. The world is an inward drama of the Trinity. It may be said both that God is completely transcendent to man and that he is immanent in man. There must be revealed in me not only God and the divine but man as well, my human nature. This means man must be born in God. The plurality of the world has a positive religious meaning. Eternity is the heritage not only of God but of man, as profit from the world process. This is the meaning of Christianity, as a religion of divine humanity. The Trinity is the long through which Berdyaev covers his pluralist metaphysical short. He rejects the idea of a single, unique creator God in favor of the unity of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit in one Godhead, of three free and independent beings existing in a concrete oneness.
Berdyaev appears to acknowledge the metaphysical necessity of pluralism, yet cannot take this necessity to its conclusions. Instead, he hedges his pluralism through what he calls the dynamic development of God within the Trinity embedded within the mononess of the Godhead. Or something to that extent. The crux of the Berdyaev hedge involves ensuring that the orthodox supplies ample cover for any and all heterodox speculations. Unfortunately, this hedge also seems to have prevented or hindered many authentic and thorough breakthroughs in Berdyaev's thinking. Note added, Berdyaev's mono-pluralism might be his way of attempting to express dyadic relationships, but as is the case with many of his declarations, implication overrules explication. How not to conduct a metaphysical inquiry. Bruce Charlton. Christa, of the orthosphere, is very good at expounding his own metaphysical assumptions, which are essentially those of Thomistic Roman Catholicism, but when it comes to making a comparative evaluation of different metaphysical systems, well, he just doesn't ever do it. Christa is an old internet pal, going back to the time before I was a Christian, and we interact affectionately offline. Indeed, I would regard him as a pen friend, a good person, honest and trustworthy and, so far, at least, on the right side in the spiritual war of this world. But for more than a decade this matter of what it is to conduct a metaphysical inquiry is one concerning which I have been apparently, across multiple online interactions, utterly unable to get across my argument. In a recent post, Krista discusses the matter of whether reality is ultimately one, monism, or many, pluralism. By his argument, Krista apparently supposes that he has logically rejected pluralism as in essence incoherent, therefore necessarily wrong. Yet what he has done in his discourse is merely to demonstrate that when someone has accepted the assumptions of monism, then swapped out the assumptions that everything is one and replaced it with an assumptions of pluralism, the result does not make sense. I say again, Krista believes he is conducting a metaphysical inquiry and comparing different metaphysical systems, but he is not. In actuality he is just expounding his pre-existing metaphysics, rooted in pre-existing assumptions, and I assert they are assumptions, concerning the fundamental nature of reality. And then Krista is correctly demonstrating that his Thomism becomes incoherent if one was to introduce pluralism into it. Which is of course, true. Pluralism does not, and cannot, cohere with an otherwise monist metaphysical system. Krista's argument does not at all mean that pluralism is necessarily incoherent, for example when pluralism is one part of a different set of fundamental assumptions concerning the nature of reality. I think the fundamental reason why I cannot get through to Krista on this matter, why we keep having the same non-argument over and again, is that he regards his own metaphysical assumptions as necessarily true, and this blocks his ability, and interest, in making any other assumptions, even for the purposes of philosophical debate. And perhaps Krista regards his own assumptions as necessarily true because he does not acknowledge that they lead to any fundamental problems. For example, I think he does not acknowledge the ineradicable depth of the problem of explaining genuine free agency for men in a reality conceptualized as created from nothing by an omni-God. Nor do I think Krista appreciates the ineradicable depth of the problem of accounting for the existence of evil in a reality wholly created by a wholly good, and omnipotent, God. And, to speculate further, I think Krista does not acknowledge the depth of these problems, because he is satisfied by those abstract and complex answers provided by Thomism. And, to complete the circle, these are answers that themselves assume the metaphysical primacy of abstractions. As examples, Krista, following traditional Roman Catholic teaching, assumes the fundamental and necessary truth of God's omniscience/omnipotence/omnipresence, etc., and these are abstractions. Similarly, creation from nothing, ex nihilo, is assumed to be necessary, and that is an abstraction. More fundamentally, Krista's understanding of God as God is an abstract one. His understanding of God is in terms of the definitional necessity of God having certain abstract attributes, such as those above. Although we can note that such a focus seems to date from early in the history of Christianity, albeit there is no evidence of it in the contemporary eyewitness account of the fourth gospel, we can still ask why is it that abstraction occupies such a fundamental position in Christian metaphysics. And our answer will depend on further assumptions regarding the nature of Christianity. For Krista, and apparently for most Christians since some time after the ascension of Jesus, there can be no such thing as Christianity except from within the perspective of the Church, however that is defined. For Krista, the Church just is Christianity, and this is not a matter for legitimately Christian metaphysical inquiry. To challenge or doubt what has been assumed for maybe 1900 years, makes no Christian sense. To do so is simply not to be a Christian. To assume, as I do, that being a Christian is a primary reality that has no necessary link to any particular metaphysical assumptions, and no necessary relationship to any church in general or particular, does not for Krista imply the legitimate possibility of further inquiry, but invites explanation in terms of ignorance, insanity or sin. This is related to other matters concerning what Christians ought to be doing, here and now. For Krista, Thomism is just true, the nature of Christianity derives from the truth and necessity of the Roman Catholic Church, and therefore all legitimately Christian futures must build upon these. But for me, this version, as I regard it, of Christianity has deep metaphysical problems that require better metaphysical solutions, or else Christianity will continue to disappear. For me, modernity has been, in part, an increased conscious awareness of the unsatisfactory nature of traditional Christian, for example monist, omni-God, abstract, understandings of human freedom and the origins of evil. I regard metaphysical awareness and inquiry as non-optional, as absolutely necessary if Christianity is to avoid what I see as the long-term, relentless, and accelerating trend of either explicit or de facto apostasy, which, for me, was made evident in 2020, when all the Christian churches, including the Roman Catholic Church, willingly, and without later repentance, subordinated themselves to the globalist agenda of totalitarian evil. So, these apparently trivial interpersonal debates between myself and Krista, or failures to debate, as I regard them, are like the tip of an iceberg of differences that I regard as ultimately sustained by a deep and long-term problem of wrong metaphysical assumptions about Christianity being instead regarded as necessary and true metaphysical assumptions. Note added. Krista responded to this post here. At Krista, I, like you, reject radical ontological pluralism as being incoherent, so everything you say about that subject is, I'm afraid, irrelevant. Instead, you can and should assume that I regard every single theologian of the past as significantly in error, and that there really is nobody else who has the same metaphysical assumptions as I do. You are candid enough to acknowledge your assumption that since I am in a minority of one, therefore I must necessarily be wrong, so, from your perspective, there is no point in wasting time on finding out what I do believe. I don't blame anyone for ignoring anything, we are each responsible for our own salvation, primarily. But I personally believe that this attitude of seeking truth in some kind of consensus of past and status is both anti-Christian, in the sense of being opposed to what Jesus said and wanted, and, here and now, a guarantee of choosing the wrong side in the spiritual war of this world. We are not so alone nor so ignorant as you assume. Much true knowledge is born into us as children, and God has ensured that each of us has sufficient wit to discern his own salvation, with the personal guidance of the Holy Ghost. God would surely not have been so foolish as to depend upon each and every person getting good guidance from his external social environment. But, there again we are up against utterly different basic assumptions. Yours is that anything true and important on the subject of Christian theology has already been said, and therefore truth should be sought among external authorities. My assumption is that the prime reality of our life of salvation and theosis is rooted in a personal relationship between ourselves and Jesus Christ, and that we not only can but must, post-mortally if not before, take personal responsibility for our ultimate choices. You complain that I do not explain myself in the comments sections of blog posts. True enough. I have given up on that mug's game. Instead, I have written hundreds of blog posts, as well as the Lazarus Writes mini-book, over the past decade, explaining and re-explaining my metaphysical assumptions and arguments from as many different angles as seemed helpful, and as simply and clearly as I am able. I have also addressed the specific critiques you make. But I expect you would not find my points acceptable, exactly because your basic assumptions are so completely different. For example, your discourse takes place outside of time/timeless/ in simultaneity of time, subspecie itenitatis, whereas I assume that time is, as it were, intrinsic to reality, because the pluralism of primal reality is made of beings, and beings are living and dynamic conscious entities. Therefore, for me, all fundamental explanations require allowance for time. This has many consequences. For instance, I believe we began with pluralism, with many uncoordinated entities, and God's creation, which is happening in time, has been, and is progressively imposing unity or cohesion upon that primal chaos. For me, this explains why both oneness and pluralism, creation and chaos, are part of our mortal experience. It's all there, on my blog, for anyone who is interested, of which only a handful of people have been, but those few seem to understand me accurately enough. And if someone is not interested, well, that's his business, but not mine. After all, my main motive in writing so many hundreds of posts per year is to clarify and critique my ideas for my benefit. The readers are mostly just looking over my shoulder. In sum, you have clearly set out some of the many reasons why you do not want to engage with what I actually believe. You feel no need for it, and already assume I must be wrong. While, on my side, my unique theology has happened only because I have already, to my own satisfaction, known and rejected that which you regard as true. What I am saying is that our decisions rule out any genuine metaphysical discourse, which explains why this has never actually happened. While it only takes one side to make a war, it takes at least two people to have a metaphysical discussion. War and Totalitarianism. Bruce Charlton. When Orwell's 1984 was written, there seemed to be an obvious relationship between war and totalitarianism, such that apparent, perpetual war was a condition of the continued domination of the leadership class. My understanding is that this was a transitional reality, true only insofar as religion retained a residual power to motivate. Only when the motivation for war could be assumed, and in a strong state, could it be inferred that war would tend to lead to the totalitarian goals of omni-surveillance and micro-regulation. Yet, in the long term, sufficient national motivation has turned out to depend on a strong national religion. And since religion as a primary motivator has disappeared from all modern industrial states, excepting the Fire Nation, there is no compelling reason why war would necessarily lead to an advance in actual totalitarianism. And indeed, totalitarianism per se is an atheist ideology, so that the presence of a strongly motivating religion means that the increase in social organization and reduction in individual freedoms etc. becomes more of the nature of theocracy than totalitarianism. But, being an atheist, Orwell failed to distinguish between totalitarianism and a genuine theocracy. Indeed, in the absence of significant and positive national motivation, there are good reasons to suppose the opposite would happen, i.e. that war will nowadays lead to the collapse of effective totalitarianism with a progressive breakdown of hierarchy, coordination, and control. Here and now, war leads to more chaos, not to an increase of imposed order. This is because the situation of national war is ripe for corruption, for manipulation, exploitation, theft, sabotage. Strategic and coordinated prosecution of the international war will be overwhelmed by the much more immediate incentives of an intranational war of each against all. Even when there are explicit, long-termist, positive national goals such as survival or conquest, even when there is a genuine external threat, the proximate human and institutional motivation will be to distort and misuse these goals as a rationale for selfish short-termism. And without religion, the tendency over time is that proximate motives will be the strongest. Trying to destroy the One Ring versus everything else. Bruce Charlton. One point about Gandalf's plan to destroy the One Ring by sending Frodo into Mordor, is that, on the one hand, it had potential to be decisive, while on the other hand it had a very low apparent chance of success. By comparison, there were many other high probability options of improving the situation a bit, but none of these could possibly affect the final outcome of defeat. Short-termism and common sense was heavily in favor of doing almost anything except sending a hobbit into Mordor, yet none of these alternatives would, even if they worked, and even in theory, be able to do more than delay the inevitable. Life's like that, at the microcosm and macrocosm, did we but recognize it. We could pour our efforts into small, but ultimately insignificant, improvements, or else we could make our best effort to do that one thing which really has potential to be decisive. Of course, the first step is to discover that which has potential to be decisive. And that is something which nobody else is going to tell you, just as nobody told Gandalf what might possibly be achieved. And it is something which will seem stupid, reckless, insane, or even evil, to most normal people, to that majority who cannot or will not see farther than whatever ameliorates some current problem. Once again, you are on your own. Once again, if you don't take responsibility, then the good thing will not be done. But, after you have failed, and as all goes under, you will have cast iron excuses why it did not happen, why you did not take the tiny crazy chance of doing the right thing. Excuses that everybody will acknowledge as valid. With life, it's a matter of what you ultimately take most seriously. Is Dale Carnegie the patron saint of the based? Bruce Charlton. The right or based blogosphere, or manosphere in its various manifestations, strikes me as the latest iteration of a theme of self-improvement that probably began with Machiavelli's The Prince, included Samuel Smiles, who coined self-help, Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People, and many versions of the power of positive thinking. Every day, in every way, I'm getting better and better. Nowadays there are many blogs catering to this theme, online podcasts and lectures, as well as books. The idea is to improve your own life, by key insights, or new behaviors, with improved being in some way that matters to you. Maybe simply feeling better about yourself, getting more money and or a better job, improving health and bigger muscles, +/greater strength, defending against violence, surviving disaster, gaining the admiration of men, or getting more sex with more women. Self-help is implicitly rooted in secret knowledge, and this secret is always some key information about becoming clearer and more focused on what genuinely benefits you, and the key insight is about how to pursue your own self-interest more effectively. In a nutshell, the appeal is a promise of more effectual hedonism. Well, all very understandable. But what does this kind of stuff have to do with being a Christian? To do with following Jesus Christ, to resurrection into eternal heavenly life. To ask is to answer. I wish I could fuse and blend my home with nature like those grand design folks. Francis Berger. I first became aware of the home design and building TV program Grand Designs during my 9-month teaching stint in the UK. For those unfamiliar with the show, it basically chronicles the construction of unconventionally planned residences in Great Britain. The bulk of these grand designs qualified as what I personally refer to as architorture, ghastly rhomboid concrete structures with unsightly angled roofs defying all geometric logic. However, every now and then, the show would feature the painstaking restoration of a medieval ruin, or abandoned lighthouse, which was always intriguing viewing. Regardless of what the grand design was, it unfailingly featured enormous windows, panes of glass, or supersized glass doors, all crafted to open into nature, thereby fusing and blending interior and exterior landscapes. Every week, I would watch UK homeowners gleefully throw open 30-foot high French doors or crank up 50-foot wide panes of glass and then inhale deeply as they basked in the glory of their practically open-air homes, seamlessly becoming one with the Yorkshire Dales or the Cornish countryside. I wish I could live like that. I really do. Unfortunately, if I accidentally leave my regular-sized entrance door open for more than 30 seconds, half of the insect population of my village inevitably comes rushing into the house. The same goes for an open window if we happen to forget to pull down the screen. Open the regular-sized terrace door. I did that once to air out the house and received a rather unwelcome visit from a backyard garter snake, in addition to the insects, of course. The only thing that is always somewhat open is the cat door with the swinging flap mounted onto the back door, but the cat only uses that when she wants to sneak a live mouse or bird into the house for playtime. But good on those grand design folks. They have all managed to fuse and blend their houses with the natural world in ways I can only dream. Saving us from what? The twin prongs of romantic Christianity. Bruce Charlton. From what does Jesus save us? To simplify, one might first say Jesus saved us from death, by his offer of resurrection. And Jesus also saved us from an ultimately purposeless and meaningless mortal life, i.e. alienation, by resurrection into that second creation which is heaven. Both are achieved by an eternal commitment to live by love. Salvation from death and from alienation are the twin prongs of romantic Christianity, the Christian, and the romantic, which are distinguishable, but which can be separated only by destruction of the valuable whole. In theory, as of here and now, we might be Christian or romantic solely. In practice, in these end times ruled by evil, unless both are present, then motivations are so enfeebled that we shall become corrupted into conformity with the demonic agenda. In stereotypical traditional societies, although not nowadays in the West, this might be summarized as the first appeal of Christianity being different for those who live in expectation of death, for example in famine, war, or old age, than for those, adolescents and young adults, mostly, who are preparing for a functional adult life, and who are often afflicted by a sense of the pointlessness of mortal existence. In the past, alienation was often ameliorated by social palliatives, by those leaving their birth family becoming members of another close-knit group. Hence the vitality of churches. But this alternative has been largely abolished by modernity and bureaucracy, and changes in human consciousness. Mostly, such communities are now experienced negatively, as intolerably oppressive, as exploitative. From here and now it seems that the answers of Christianity remain qualitatively the same, but have shifted from the material and external, for example churches, and the objective efficacy of religious symbolism and observances causally linked to resurrection, to the spiritual, to inner commitments within the realm of thinking. Of course, to regard Jesus as Savior is an instance of double negative theology, and the underlying reality is that in a positive sense Jesus offered a possible basis for living well this mortal life, for a mortal life that escapes futility and gains eternal purpose and meaning from the expectation of resurrected life. In other words, both prongs of romantic Christianity ought to arise from the same root, which is that we know with inner and intuitive sureness that our own individual reality is truly personal, and we have chosen to be part of divine creation, and that our part is eternally significant for the whole. Strait is the gate. William Wildblood. A few days ago I was out for my usual early evening walk. The particular circular route I was taking this time started off in a local park, then proceeded up a road that goes to the downs and then across a field with horses that leads to a small wood from where it's a mile or so home. I like this walk because of its variety, but this day I was feeling the routine and, to be frank, monotony of my daily life more than usual. Many years ago I was told by my teachers that my life must continue in a routine until I left my physical body, and such has been the case up until now. I realize this is necessary, unglamorous as it seems, as a spiritual discipline, but sometimes it can become frustrating, and on this occasion I was feeling that frustration. The spiritual darkness of the contemporary world was also weighing down on me, and I lamented this out loud, asking God and my guides if a little break in the clouds might be possible. "Don't be weak," came the response as a thought in my head. "You are lucky to be in the position you are in, where you can see what you do. When you reject the world you cannot expect worldly reward and satisfaction. When you allow God to work on you, you must be prepared for hardship on the level of the earthly ego. That was all very well, but still I asked for a little light in the darkness. When these thoughts were going through my head, I turned off the road going to the downs and into the field with horses. Luckily I had my phone with me as I was expecting a call from my daughter. I don't usually carry it when I go out. This is what I saw. The last time I had gone through this field there was a path that led to the woods at the end, and it was twice the width it was now. There had also been no gate. The landowner had clearly decided to reduce the size of what was a public right-of-way through his field and put up a gate and posts to narrow the path. That was a pity, but what struck me was that here, almost immediately after I had asked my question, was the answer to it. It came from Matthew 7:14.
Strait is the gate and narrow the way which leadeth unto life, and few there be that find it.
I had been lamenting the circumscription of my life, but here I was being told in no uncertain terms. What do you expect? This is how it is. Stop complaining, open the gate and go through. If it weren't for the fact that this teaching is applicable to others, I wouldn't mention it here. After all, it's a tiny incident, and its significance would be lost on most people. That significance could even be entirely imaginary. But I do think God speaks to us at certain times. He does not thunder from on high. He speaks so softly we might miss it if we weren't paying attention. On this occasion, though, it seemed to me that he answered my question in a perfect way. Ahem, the Empire, in Star Wars, was evil. Obviously. Bruce Charlton. Over the years and recently, I've seen several revisionist arguments that the Empire in the original Star Wars trilogy of movies was actually good. This is the conclusion of evaluating Luke Skywalker and his gang of rebels to be the real baddies, broadly on the basis that they are, at root, just the usual leftist fantasy revolutionaries, as imagined by the 1960s US counterculture. But this is nuts. Regardless of the nature of the rebels, the Empire was clearly depicted as a totalitarian regime, ruled by demonic, dark side, affiliated and control-motivated types. This specific error of discernment is worth noting, because it is one instance of a general phenomenon that is an increasingly frequent and powerful, defending harmonic evil, on the pragmatic basis that it is not so bad as the changes being proposed, to the point of actively supporting that evil. In this instance of original Star Wars, which is from some 50 years ago when Luciferic evil had been strong for the last time in the form of the 60s version of hedonic freedom, the idea is that we ought to take the side of communitarian order against the chaos ensuring from individualistic self-expression. Nowadays, the harmonic system is mostly defended against the spitefully destructive Sorathic spirit of encouraging war, famine and disease. The snare is that it is natural and good up to a point to defend that which is traditional, culturally significant, and functional, which will include much that is virtuous, beautiful and true, against that which would remove it. But only good up to a point, because these are ultimately, from an eternal and spiritual perspective, secondary matters, and we therefore must be prepared to abandon them when resistance does more harm than good. I should be clear. To defend any particular thing which is good can itself become evil, when it leads towards affiliation to evil, hence rejection of salvation. No matter how specifically good something may be, there may come a point that it must be set aside. Such is the nature of our life, task, and challenge in this mortal life. The snare is that we are, in practice, offered a package deal, in which the package is the net evil harmonic system, and we can only retain the many specific goods by sustaining net evil totalitarianism, and when such arguments from practicality become internalized and personalized into a spiritual affiliation to the side of evil. For Christians, this happens with their churches. There are always powerfully destructive forces at work against anything that is noble, beautiful and meaningful in the churches. These attacks are, almost invariably for the past few generations, evil motivated, whether the luciferic evil of desiring permission and endorsement for one's own, often sex-related or sexual, sometimes materialist/careerist, sins. Sometimes the attacks are motivated by sheerly spiteful pleasure of destroying that which is regarded as a source of good. Yet, beyond a certain point, to pour time, energy and effort into resisting these many-pronged attacks, sooner or later actually entails supporting an already net evil social institution that is deeply integrated into the global totalitarian bureaucracy. In other words, to defend the church tends strongly to slide into defending the empire, which is exactly what we see with the revisionist interpretations of Star Wars. Because all large, powerful, ancient, mainstream Christian churches depend upon the system for their survival, as well as because the churches are under continual attack from luciferic and, increasingly, sorothic forces. Then we get the very familiar phenomenon of loyal and devout Christian church members who implicitly, covertly but decisively have abandoned their Christianity, and affiliated with Armonic totalitarianism. The rebels usually are wrong and would make matters worse. However, the empire is, by nature and intent, a machine designed for the damnation of men, and we must not forget that massive fact. Still staring into a prolonged eclipse. Francis Berger. Honestly, I am not immensely interested in what Plato and the Platonists have been banging on about for the past 2,500 years. What interests me is what Jesus said 2,000 years ago. In my book, Jesus' 2,000-year-old words created a cosmic shift that should have tempered the incessant 500-year-old Platonic drumbeat, and cast it in an entirely new light. Unfortunately, the opposite occurred. Men utilized Plato, and many other systems, models, and ideas, to correct and amend the cosmic shift, thereby muting and obscuring its simplicity and significance in man's thinking. The magnitude or reality of the cosmic shift is still there, but it has been obscured in much the same way the moon obscures the sun during a solar eclipse. Men have been staring wide-eyed into that eclipse for over 2 millennia, believing the dark circle and its dazzling corona to be the source of all light. Nearly all have been unwilling to comprehend that the true light emanates from behind the dark orb. Men have been partially blinded. A prolonged eclipse has a way of doing that. Why are ultimate choices clearer and simpler than before, despite these end times of totalitarian value inversion? Bruce Charlton. If it is accepted that these are the end times in the sense I discuss, and if it is recognized that populations in the West are pervasively subjected to an ideology of atheist leftist materialism via the mass media and the totalitarian state, then, one might assume that the situation is hopelessly complex and confusing, and that an individual has near zero chance of navigating through that ocean of untruthfulness and deception which constitutes mainstream discourse. Yet, I would say instead that the ultimate things of life have never been clearer and simpler to people. So clear, and so simple, that all individuals are able to make the discernments they need to make, to live their lives as they need to live them, if that is they desire, and to choose salvation, if they wish for it. Nowadays, the deceptions, confusions, insanity etc. are all so very extreme, and their rationalizations so ridiculous, as to be self-refuting at a very deep and irresistible level. Whatever excuses people make to themselves, many have decided to believe that which they know, deep down and unignorably, is evil nonsense. What we are really up against in these end times, is not social conditions hostile to real values. We are up against a dawning realization that not many people desire that which Jesus Christ offers. This, because these are times of mainstream, top-down, encouraged, and increasingly mandatory, value inversion, and we all have knowledge of true values built into us and available for guidance via the Holy Ghost. Inverted values are not just incoherent, which incoherence cannot be hidden, but also we know that these official values are false. Yes, excuses for embracing inverted values are not just available but positively socially approved and supported. But we know this too. In a nutshell, even though the external world propagates and proves value inversions near universally, nonetheless, our inner and real selves cannot help but understand that this is false. And when we choose to ignore our intuition and subordinate our souls to external influences, our intuition knows this too. The unpalatable truth is that we already know what we need to know, and we just are responsible for our choices. Yet, evil choices must be made and remade, so long as we live, and can be changed. And that imposes its own kind of pressure. Table Talk by Coleridge. William Wildblood. The excerpts below are quotes from Table Talk by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, which consists of recollections of his conversations published after his death by his nephew Henry Nelson Coleridge. I came across the first one recently and thought it very pertinent to our present time, particularly with relevance to the reaction during the recent health scare. So I looked through an online version of the book and found it full of similar pithy observations, a few of which I reproduce here with an occasional comment in italics.
There is the love of the good for the good's sake, and the love of the truth for the truth's sake. I have known many, especially women, love the good for the good's sake, but very few, indeed, and scarcely one woman, love the truth for the truth's sake. Yet without the latter, the former may become, as it has 1,000 times been, the source of persecution of the truth, the pretext and motive of inquisitorial cruelty and party zealotry.
One should add that the real good is the same as the real true, so it is the apparent or even the false good that people, especially women, prefer to the real good, and this is because it makes greater appeal to their feelings or to their desire for comfort, safety and general niceness.
The true key to the declension of the Roman Empire, which is not to be found in all Gibbon's immense work, may be stated in 2 words: the imperial character overlaying, and finally destroying, the national character. Rome under Trajan was an empire without a nation.
This is not exactly 2 words, but one can see what he means, and it could be said to be what is happening to the West now.
Kant assigns 3 great races of mankind. If 2 individuals of distinct races cross, a third, or tertium aliquid is invariably produced, different from either, as a white and a Negro produce a mulatto. But when different varieties of the same race cross, the offspring is according to what we call chance. It is now like one, now like the other parent. Note this, when you see the children of any couple of distinct European complexions, as English and Spanish, German and Italian, Russian and Portuguese, and so on.
I have noticed this in people of my acquaintance.
There are 2 principles in every European and Christian state: permanency and progression. In the civil wars of the 17th century in England, which are as new and fresh now as they were 160 years ago, and will be so forever to us, these 2 principles came to a struggle. It was natural that the great and the good of the nation should be found in the ranks of either side.
Many of the present problems are caused by the abandonment of what Coleridge calls the sense of permanency.
Either we have an immortal soul, or we have not. If we have not, we are beasts, the first and wisest of beasts, it may be, but still true beasts. We shall only differ in degree, and not in kind, just as the elephant differs from the slug. But by the concession of all the materialists of all the schools, or almost all, we are not of the same kind as beasts, and this also we say from our own consciousness. Therefore, methinks, it must be the possession of a soul within us that makes the difference.
Bring back the use of the word methinks.
This is not a logical age. A friend lately gave me some political pamphlets of the times of Charles I and the Cromwellite. In them the premises are frequently wrong, but the deductions are almost always legitimate, whereas, in the writings of the present day, the premises are commonly sound, but the conclusions false. I think a great deal of commendation is due to the University of Oxford for preserving the study of logic in the schools. It is a great mistake to suppose geometry any substitute for it.
You could apply this to our age in the sense that reasoned discourse, stripped of ideology, is becoming rarer, but I suspect that could have been said of many other times too.
St. John's logic is Oriental, and consists chiefly in position and parallel, whilst St. Paul displays all the intricacies of the Greek system.
The mystic and the philosopher.
The first three Gospels show the history, that is, the fulfillment of the prophecies and the facts. St. John declares explicitly the doctrine, oracularly, and without comment, because, being pure reason, it can only be proved by itself. For Christianity proves itself, as the sun is seen by its own light. Its evidence is involved in its existence. St. Paul writes more particularly for the dialectic understanding, and proves those doctrines, which were capable of such proof, by common logic.
The proof of Christianity lies in the fact that it offers us more than we could have ever hoped for or imagined.
St. John used the term logos technically. Philo Judaeus had so used it several years before the probable date of the composition of this gospel, and it was commonly understood amongst the Jewish rabbis at that time, and afterwards, of the manifested God. The Jewish church understood the Messiah to be a divine person. Philo expressly cautions against anyone supposing the logos to be a mere personification, or symbol. He says the logos is a substantial, self-existent being. The Gnostics, as they were afterwards called, were a kind of Arians, and thought the logos was an afterbirth. They placed the abyss and silence before him. Therefore it was that St. John said, with emphasis, "In the beginning was the Word. He was begotten in the first simultaneous burst of Godhead," if such an expression may be pardoned, in speaking of eternal existence.
To assert that God is a person is not a childish projection but the most advanced religious doctrine.
The national debt has, in fact, made more men rich than have a right to be so.
It certainly has, and even more so today.
Pantheism and idolatry naturally end in each other, for all extremes meet.
As now when completely incompatible ideologies unite to contest the real.
Plato's works are logical exercises for the mind. Little that is positive is advanced in them. Socrates may be fairly represented by Plato in the more moral parts, but in all the metaphysical disquisitions it is Pythagoras.
It's a pity we know Plato by his nickname, or we could talk of Aristocles, his real name, and Aristotle. Apparently he was given this nickname, which means broad as in broad-chested, by his wrestling coach. All philosophers should have a wrestling coach.
In fact, there are the popular, the sacerdotal, and the mysterious religions of Greece, represented roughly by Homer, Pindar, and Aeschylus. The ancients had no notion of the fall of man, though they had of his gradual degeneracy. Prometheus, in the old mythos, and for the most part in Aeschylus, is the Redeemer and the devil jumbled together.
An interesting insight.
Most women have no character at all, said Pope, and meant it for satire. Shakespeare, who knew man and woman much better, saw that it, in fact, was the perfection of woman to be characterless. Everyone wishes a Desdemona or Ophelia for a wife, creatures who, though they may not always understand you, do always feel you, and feel with you.
If the highest state of matter is to reflect spirit perfectly, you can see what he means here.
The man's desire is for the woman, but the woman's desire is rarely other than for the desire of the man.
A generalization but not without substance.
I cannot say I expect much from mere Egyptian antiquities. Everything really that is intellectually great in that country seems to me of Grecian origin.
Sometimes he gets it wrong. On the other hand, and see below, the Greeks did make rational what the Egyptians seemed only to understand intuitively.
There was, I conceive, one great Gepetic original of language, under which Greek, Latin, and other European dialects, and, perhaps, Sanskrit, range as species. The Gepetic race separated into two branches, one, with a tendency to migrate southwest, Greeks, Italians, and the other northwest, Goths, Germans, Swedes. The Hebrew is Semitic.
Gepetic means descending from Noah's son Japheth and seems to refer here to Indo-Europeans. I more clearly see that the doctrine of trinal unity, that is to say, the Trinity, is an absolute truth transcending my human means of understanding it.
The result of my system will be to show that, so far from the world being a goddess in petticoats, it is rather the devil in a strait waistcoat.
More true than ever today.
The controversy of the nominalists and realists was one of the greatest and most important that ever occupied the human mind. They were both right and both wrong. They each maintained opposite poles of the same truth, which truth neither of them saw, for want of a higher premise.
I see what he means, but I would still place the realists above the nominalists. The latter could be said to be the origin of modern materialism.
A fall of some sort or other, the creation, as it were, of the non-absolute, is the fundamental postulate of the moral history of man. Without this hypothesis, man is unintelligible. With it, every phenomenon is explicable. The mystery itself is too profound for human insight.
The doctrine of the fall makes sense of so much.
A woman's head is usually over ears and her heart. Man seems to have been designed for the superior being of the two, but as things are, I think women are generally better creatures than men. They have, taken universally, weaker appetites and weaker intellects, but they have much stronger affections. A man with a bad heart has been sometimes saved by a strong head, but a corrupt woman is lost forever.
The tragedy of feminism, which poses as a liberator but actually corrupts.
The Trinity is the will, 2. The reason, or word, 3. The love, or life. As we distinguish these three, so we must unite them in one God. The union must be as transcendent as the distinction. If a man's conduct cannot be ascribed to the angelic, nor to the bestial within him, what is there left for us to refer it to, but the fiendish? Passion without any appetite is fiendish.
Demons exist.
The best way to bring a clever young man who has become skeptical and unsettled to reason, is to make him feel something. Love, if sincere and unworldly, will, in 9 instances out of 10, bring him to a sense and assurance of something real and actual, and that sense alone will make him think to a sound purpose, instead of dreaming that he is thinking.
We must distinguish between feeling and feelings.
Talent, lying in the understanding, is often inherited, genius, being the action of reason and imagination, rarely or never. I, for one, do not call the sod under my feet my country. But language, religion, laws, government, blood, identity in these makes men of one country.
Immigration without proper integration is a disaster. This is why it should be kept to reasonable limits, limits which it has far exceeded in Western nations in recent years.
The Pilgrim's Progress is composed in the lowest style of English, without slang or false grammar. If you were to polish it, you would at once destroy the reality of the vision. For works of imagination should be written in very plain language. The more purely imaginative they are, the more necessary it is to be plain. Party men always hate a slightly differing friend more than a downright enemy. I quite calculate on my being one day or other holden in worse repute by many Christians than the Unitarians and open infidels. It must be undergone by everyone who loves the truth for its own sake beyond all other things.
It's more important to be on the right side than to believe exactly the same things.
People may say what they please about the gradual improvement of the arts. It is not true of the substance. The arts and the muses both spring forth in the youth of nations, like Minerva from the front of Jupiter, all armed. Manual dexterity may, indeed, be improved by practice.
The difference between inspiring impulse and execution.
I hold all claims set up for Egypt having given birth to the Greek philosophy to be groundless. It sprang up in Greece itself, and began with physics only. Then it took in the idea of a living cause and made pantheism out of the two. Socrates introduced ethics, and taught duties, and then, finally, Plato asserted or reasserted the idea of a God, the maker of the world. The measure of human philosophy was thus full, when Christianity came to add what before was wanting, assurance. After this again, the Neo-Platonists joined theurgy with philosophy, which ultimately degenerated into magic and mere mysticism.
Egypt probably did not have an intellectualized philosophy as such, but it did have a highly developed knowledge of mysticism and magic. Otherwise, this is not a bad history of religion in the West. This is just a small selection from the first half of the book. I may do another post on the remainder, but it serves to remind us that Coleridge was much more than just a romantic poet. Did Sauron recycle power from the 3 recovered Dwarf Rings? Bruce Charlton. Apparently, Sauron reclaimed 3 of the 7 Dwarf Rings, the other 4 seem to have been destroyed by dragon fire. Sauron later offered to give one to Dane Two-Iron-Foot, king under the mountain, as reward for helping find Baggins the Hobbit. But Sauron may have been lying. After all, the Dwarf Rings didn't work as Sauron intended. They failed to subordinate the dwarvish race to Sauron's will. Instead, the Dwarf Rings seemed to increase greed and covetousness, already archetypical dwarvish vices, while making it easier to accumulate treasure by trade. That is, if a ring-wearing dwarf traded in lead, he would become wealthy in lead, likewise for silver, gems, or gold. As the possessor of the last of the seven to be unreclaimed by Sauron, Thorin's grandfather Thror said to his son Thrain, the ring needed gold to breed gold. So, what did Sauron do with the 3 dwarf rings he repossessed? I see 3 possible options. 1. Sauron kept and guarded the 3 dwarf rings, to ensure that nobody else could get hold of them, in particular so that no dwarf could become wealthy and powerful enough to threaten, or, at least, to interfere with, Sauron's plans. 2. Sauron intended to use the 3 remaining rings as bargaining chips to buy the cooperation of dwarves. This is implied by Gloin's account of Sauron's messenger offering to give Dane, king under the mountain, one of the dwarf rings as a reward for helping to find Bilbo and the One Ring, rings that he allegedly had stolen. If Sauron's messenger was speaking the truth, then at least one of the remaining 3 rings was still available for this purpose. However, there is no reason to assume that Sauron's messenger was speaking the truth. It may have been that Sauron had zero intention of ever returning any ring. It may be that Sauron would have broken his promise. Thus, if Dane had indeed cooperated with Sauron, and the Hobbit ring bearer had been found and the One Ring captured by Sauron, then it seems likely that Sauron would just have broken the deal, and simply kept the dwarf ring. 3. A third possibility is that Sauron would be able to reclaim the power that he had invested in the 3 recovered dwarf rings, by means of destroying the 3 rings in some particular magical procedure. This assumes that if Sauron knew how to put some of his innate power into a ring, he would also know how to get that power back again in process of destroying that ring. Presumably, because he had access to the hottest fires in Middle-earth in Mount Doom, what was technically possible to Sauron may not have been possible to anyone else. My best guess is that this third option was the most likely, i.e. that Sauron had, by the War of the Ring, already boosted his own power somewhat, by reclaiming much of what power he had put into each of the 3 dwarf rings that Sauron had repossessed. Note, the above information derives from The Lord of the Rings, especially Appendix A, 3, and The History of Middle-earth Volume 12, The Peoples of Middle-earth. The Point and Shallow Motivation. Francis Berger. Things coming to a point should inspire a re-evaluation of motivations. Ideally, shallow motivations should give way to deeper motivations. At the very least, shallow motivations ought to be recognized and acknowledged as shallow. The absence of that leaves little room or opportunity for repentance, to say nothing of nurturing deeper motivations. Overcoming shallow motivations is often difficult, primarily because they can be so easily replaced with other, equally shallow motivations. Thus, prevailing over one shallow motivation often does little more than create space for some other trivial impetus. The reasons for this are many. Suffice it to say that shallow motivations reflect our innate weakness, and the innate imperfection of mortal life in this world. So, we should not punish ourselves for failing to overcome all our shallow motivations, but we must also resist making excuses for such failures. We must be sincere about our shallow motivations, see them for what they are, recognize where they fall short, and repent our inability to renounce them and look deeper. Most of all, we must not allow ourselves to be lured by the temptation to characterize shallow motivations as deep ones. Giving in to this temptation is a clear sign of intentionally missing the point. Stop the presses. The global establishment are censoring and punishing true statements. Bruce Charlton. The radical left are outraged at the way that, since the current Arrakis conflict erupted, anything regarded as in any way critical of CHOAM or supportive of the Freeman is being, officially as well as informally, and via much of the Western bureaucracy and media, multivalently demonized, blocked, and actively punished. For the PC/woke/radical leftists, this is something absolutely new, radical, terrifying. Meanwhile, back in the real world, this is a minuscule incremental progression of a nearly 60-year and exponential trend of thought policing. Yet it is indeed significant that the ultimate powers of the totalitarian system have decided, because this whole thing has been contrived and managed, to drive an expanding wedge into and through the middle of the road versus the radical wings of the establishment. It is a decisive step away from the unified global establishment that was in power following the international coup of early 2020, and a step in the direction of global chaos, reinforcing the multi-front World War III schemes, including, in order, Eastern Europe, Middle East, Far East, that have split the nations of the world. So there is a global ideological, plus fighting, war between the West and the rest, and within the West an ideological war that is, presumably, intended to become a fighting war. As usual, pacifism is neither a real option nor desirable, because it would avoid two-sided war only at the price of passive genocide by one side of the other. After all, it only takes one side to make a war. All of this is inevitable and unstoppable in a post-religious, materialist world rooted in an ideology of negative values, a world that lacks even a theoretical belief in purpose, meaning, or transcendence of mortal life, and which is therefore, for lack of anything else, easily led by, because it has zero grounds from which to resist, selfish, short-termist and emotional manipulations. Great spiritual advice from William Arkle, but very difficult to follow. Bruce Charlton. So often the case, eh? Somebody writes something, and when you read it you have a sense that it could be an answer, that if you could go ahead and do this, then, well, things would be a lot better, for sure. So then you try it. You try to do what the person suggested doing. And, well, it doesn't happen, but instead you just lapse into the usual stuff. Example, the following striking passage is excerpted in John Flint's collection of William Arkle's later writings. It comes from a letter that Flint received from Arkle in 1997, somewhat edited by me, for clarity.
Where do the succession of thoughts arise from within oneself, thought and feelings and attention? Most of the time these are conditioned as a response to what goes on outside. But when we are alone, in the dark, or eyes closed, and there is nothing special on our mind, and we are free for a while to do as we like without own conscious world, what do we do with our thinking then? Do we seek other stimulus, go to sleep, or do we create the now that we most like to be with? If we do the latter, it spreads into the future nows, so that, in a godlike way, we take charge of our nows and call to ourselves the very best ones. Our present attention is in fact, I believe, a godlike command to the ethers, and our great friend, God, wants us to learn to use it well, beautifully, playfully, and for Him and all other delighting. And of our own fulfilling with value, purpose and joy. This is the only everlasting purpose after all.
William Arkle is making a very concrete suggestion here, about how we might best use our freest moments. It is clear enough what he means in a negative way, of what we shouldn't do, that we ought not simply to seek further external stimulation of our thinking. And we ought not to seek the oblivion of not thinking by sleeping, or doing some kinds of meditation, or maybe seeking some kind of intoxication. The difficulty is Arkle's positive injunction to create the now that we most like to be with. The suggestion is that our everlasting purpose is best served by using our thinking creatively, like God, to create in our conscious here and now thinking, the best now of which we can conceive. He goes on to say that, if this can be done, it will have a general effect via the ethers, which I take to refer to the world of thinking shared by many beings, and that shapes the world. I can well believe this. If we can indeed do as Arkle suggests and create the now that we most like to be with. For me, at least, that is one of those things that sounds simply and perfectly doable, until I actually try to do it, when my thinking reverts to its usual mundane habits of responding to external stimuli, or grinding away at dull stuff, or soon begins to switch off towards passive and dreamlike associations, or even actual sleep. The deep problem seems to be that I cannot get a specific purchase on my thinking, a basis for the desired way of thinking. The instructions are too vague and general, yet any specific instructions of what to think about and how, become merely more of the usual mundane stuff. I find that what I am hoping for is a positive transformation and elevation of thinking, but that I am not properly motivated to achieve this. Wanting it isn't enough, and may even be, seems to be, counterproductive. Indeed, I do not believe there is a general answer to this problem. I don't think there is, or can be, any plan for how to do what we most want to be done. Why? Probably because we are talking about creativity, which must be motivated by love, and that isn't something that can be ordered up on demand. My best suggestion, which I can but seldom actually follow myself, is to locate love in ourselves, some basis of actual love, and start thinking from that love. Not by statically stopping with that love, not just contemplating it, not clinging to it, but instead thinking dynamically, purposively, while holding on to that love. In practice, however, I just can't seem to do it, at least, not whenever I want to. A world of tactics without strategy, spiritual negation of the nation. Bruce Charlton. This is no more than a small hunch or observation derived from my intuitive feelings about the West now, especially the UK, especially England. There is an extraordinary and surprising vacuity of thought and attention. I would have expected that, by now, something or another, something big, would have been imposed upon us by the government media corporate establishment. I expected some kind of big thing like the Birdemic, MLB-type anti-racism, the peck frenzy or some other healthism, some ginned-up climate emergency, or a war fever. Maybe even something new. Well, no, I didn't really expect anything new, because there hasn't been anything culturally new since the 1970s. But some novel spin on the old things perhaps. But, so far, as of writing, none. Just the usual bunch of little, stale and distinctly half-hearted, pseudo-issues, perhaps mainly a drip-drip manipulation towards electing a government in which the puppets are Labour Party Tweedledums, instead of the usual Conservative Tweedledees. Yawn? But British people have, at root, never been less interested in politics, never less enthusiastic about the positive possibilities of any allowable regime change. The last residue of optimism was crushed by the vacuity, the pseudo-victory that was utter defeat, that is Brino. Last year saw the highest, admitted, levels of UK mass immigration in history, something like 700k extra people, presumably plus those many deliberately not counted, an extra 1% in 1 year with similar levels for more or less for 20 years, more people than a city the size of Sheffield, 5th biggest in England. Nothing has been learned from 2020, there is zero interest or insight concerning UK's adoption of a frontline and firing line role in the Fire Nation War, indeed there is neither interest in nor knowledge of anything at all important. Life now is a vast and settled state of spiritual negation. The past has less and less influence, but the direction and destination future is ignored as far as possible, yet the present is, compared with 50 years ago, hedged about with pervasive guilt, chronic resentments, potentially overwhelming fear and despair are only a heartbeat away. What applies to England and the UK, applies to Western civilization, and indeed to most of the world. Our civilization is bored with itself, and aspires no higher than temporary distraction from a futility that is baked into its core and deepest assumptions. The highest virtues in everyday life are means without ends, such as cheerfulness, niceness, sociability, and a keenness to express concern on matters that are encouraged, or at least allowed. Energy is admired, so long it is directed into short-termist goals like sports, pop music, charitable work, travel. This is a world of tactics without strategy, survival without meaning, as we see in Western attitudes to the Iraqis war, in which opinions, for what they are worth, run high on both sides, and peace is the mantra, but where there is no remotely realistic long-term goal that does not entail annihilation of at least one side, and potentially both. The bottom line, when there is one, for example in wars, goes no further than mere survival. Survival for what? Has become the unanswerable, hence unaskable, question. Or since survival is impossible in this mortal, entropic world, what is on offer is not so much survival as somewhat prolonged, continued existence. Our culture has defined this life as without ultimate purpose or meaning, and taking place in an accidental universe, and the mass of people now operate on that basis. In such a world, that cannot be any real strategy, and life devolves to tactics for getting by. Until getting by is recognized as more trouble than it is worth. The only solution is in our own individual minds, but hidden so deep in our assumptions, that most people regard it as irrelevant to real life, or non-existent, mere wishful thinking. Thus we make our own thought prisons, lock ourselves inside, hide the key, then forget that it ever existed. More table talk. William Wildblood. Here are some more excerpts from Coleridge's Table Talk. It's just a small selection, but what seemed to me to be the most interesting pieces and most relevant to our day.
Plotinus was a man of wonderful ability, and some of the sublimest passages I ever read are in his works.
Plotinus is indeed sublime, but he lacks one thing, which is the knowledge of Christ.
I was amused the other day with reading in Tertullian, that spirits or demons dilate and contract themselves, and wriggle about like worms.
Makes sense.
Luther has sketched the most beautiful picture of the nature and ends and duties of the wedded life I ever read. St. Paul says it is a great symbol, not mystery, as we translate it.
A symbol, presumably, of God and creation.
Why need we talk of a fiery hell? If the will, which is the law of our nature, were withdrawn from our memory, fancy, understanding, and reason, no other hell could equal, for a spiritual being, what we should then feel, from the anarchy of our powers. It would be conscious madness, a horrid thought.
Perhaps this is what hell is. When the will is so turned against God that it starts to disintegrate. Madness must ensue.
An ear for music is a very different thing from a taste for music. I have no ear whatever, I could not sing an air to save my life, but I have the intensest delight in music, and can detect good from bad. Naldi, a good fellow, remarked to me once at a concert, that I did not seem much interested with a piece of Rossini's which had just been performed. I said it sounded to me like nonsense verses. But I could scarcely contain myself when a thing of Beethoven's followed.
I understand this, being in the same boat with regard to ear and taste.
Galileo was a great genius, and so was Newton, but it would take 2 or 3 Galileos and Newtons to make one Kepler. It is in the order of providence, that the inventive, generative, constitutive mind, the Kepler, should come first, and then that the patient and collective mind, the Newton, should follow, and elaborate the pregnant queries and illumining guesses of the former. The laws of the planetary system are, in fact, due to Kepler. There is not a more glorious achievement of scientific genius upon record than Kepler's guesses, prophecies, and ultimate apprehension of the law of the mean distances of the planets as connected with the periods of their revolutions round the Sun. Gravitation, too, he had fully conceived, but, because it seemed inconsistent with some received observations on light, he gave it up, in allegiance, as he says, to nature. Yet the idea vexed and haunted his mind. Bacon, when like himself, for no man was ever more inconsistent, says, Prudens quaestio dimidium scientiae.
This is from Roger, not Francis. Translation: to ask the proper question is half of science.
It is a melancholy thing to live when there is no vision in the land. Where are our statesmen to meet this emergency?
If he could have lived now.
Is the House of Commons to be reconstructed on the principle of a representation of interests or of a delegation of men? If on the former, we may, perhaps, see our way, if on the latter, you can never, in reason, stop short of universal suffrage, and in that case, I am sure that women have as good a right to vote as men.
This is from 1830. I'm not sure if it is in favor or against universal suffrage. It depends on what he means by if on the former we may see our way. But see further excerpts below for more light on this.
Rousseau, indeed, asserts that there is an inalienable sovereignty inherent in every human being possessed of reason, and from this the framers of the Constitution of 1791 deduce that the people itself is its own sole rightful legislator, and at most dare only recede so far from its right as to delegate to chosen deputies the power of representing and declaring the general will. But this is wholly without proof, for it has been already fully shown that, according to the principle out of which this consequence is attempted to be drawn, it is not the actual man, but the abstract reason alone, that is the sovereign and rightful lawgiver. The confusion of two things so different is so gross an error, that the Constituent Assembly could scarce proceed a step in their declaration of rights without some glaring inconsistency. Children are excluded from all political power. Are they not human beings in whom the faculty of reason resides? Yes. But in them the faculty is not yet adequately developed. But are not gross ignorance, inveterate superstition, and the habitual tyranny of passion and sensuality, equally preventives of the development, equally impediments to the rightful exercise, of the reason, as childhood and early youth?
Democracy, by putting the unit, one person, one vote, above its actual capacity, reason, clearly prioritizes quantity over quality. This is its fatal flaw.
The principle on which the whole system of democracy rests is that reason is not susceptible of degree.
The above comment in a nutshell.
Necker, you remember, asked the people to come and help him against the aristocracy. The people came fast enough at his bidding, but, somehow or other, they would not go away again when they had done their work. I hope Lord Grey will not see himself or his friends in the woeful case of the conjurer who, with infinite zeal and pains, called up the devils to do something for him. They came at the word, thronging about him, grinning, and howling, and dancing, and whisking their long tails in diabolic glee, but when they asked him what he wanted of them, the poor wretch, frightened out of his wits, could only stammer forth, I pray you, my friends, be gone down again. At which the devils, with one voice, replied, Yes. Yes. We go down, but we take you with us to sink or to drown.
A warning to those who open the door to mass immigration from third world countries in order to boost their own power, popularity and/or wealth.
The malignant duplicity and unprincipled tergiversations of the specific Whig newspapers are to me detestable. I prefer the open endeavors of those publications which seek to destroy the Church. There is a sort of honesty in that which I approve, though I would with joy lay down my life to save my country from the consummation which is so evidently desired by that section of the periodical press.
Tergiversation is 1. Evasion of straightforward action or clear-cut statement, equivocation. 2. Desertion of a cause, position, party, or faith. Merriam-Webster definition. This refers to the bad faith of large sections of the left. Bad faith is often a sign of wrong motivation.
The darkest despotisms on the continent have done more for the growth and elevation of the fine arts than the English government.
A perennial complaint.
So long as Rubens confines himself to space and outward figure, to the mere animal man with animal passions, he is, I may say, a god amongst painters. His satyrs, Silenuses, lions, tigers, and dogs are almost godlike, But the moment he attempts anything involving or presuming the spiritual, his gods and goddesses, his nymphs and heroes, become beasts, absolute, unmitigated beasts. The more I see of modern pictures, the more I am convinced that the ancient art of painting is gone, and something substituted for it, very pleasing, but different, and different in kind and not in degree only. Portraits by the old masters are pictures of men and women. They fill, not merely occupy, a space. They represent individuals, but individuals as types of a species. Modern portraits, a few by Jackson and Owen, perhaps, accepted, give you not the man, not the inward humanity, but merely the external mark.
Wait for the 20th century.
As there is much beast and some devil in man, so is there some angel and some God in him. The beast and the devil may be conquered, but in this life never destroyed.
O.P.Q. in the Morning Chronicle is a clever fellow.
He is for the greatest possible happiness for the greatest possible number, and for the longest possible time. So am I, so are you, and every one of us, I will venture to say, round the tea table. First, however, what does O.P.Q. mean by the word happiness, and, secondly, how does he propose to make other persons agree in his definition of the term? Don't you see the ridiculous absurdity of setting up that as a principle or motive of action, which is, in fact, a necessary and essential instinct of our very nature, an inborn and inextinguishable desire? How can creatures susceptible of pleasure and pain do otherwise than desire happiness? But what happiness? That is the question. The American savage, in scalping his fallen enemy, pursues his happiness naturally and adequately. A Chickasaw or Pawnee Bentham or O.P.Q. would necessarily hope for the most frequent opportunities possible of scalping the greatest possible number of savages for the longest possible time. There is no escaping this absurdity unless you come back to a standard of reason and duty, imperative upon our merely pleasurable sensations. Oh. But, says O.P.Q., I am for the happiness of others. Of others? Are you indeed? Well, I happen to be one of those others, and, so far as I can judge from what you show me of your habits and views, I would rather be excused from your banquet of happiness. Your mode of happiness would make me miserable. To go about doing as much good as possible to as many men as possible, is indeed an excellent object for a man to propose to himself, but then, in order that you may not sacrifice the real good and happiness of others to your particular views, which may be quite different from your neighbors, you must do that good to others which the reason, common to all, pronounces to be good for all. In this sense your fine maxim is so very true as to be a mere truism.
The problem with this Benthamite utilitarianism which Coleridge rightly condemns is that we rarely know what constitutes true happiness or where it lies. If heaven is the real home of happiness, which it is, then everything that may lead to heaven is good and everything that does not do that or leads away from it works against happiness.
Demagogues always appeal to men as men, and, as you know, the most terrible convulsions in society have been wrought by such phrases as rights of man, sovereignty of the people, which no one understands, which apply to no one in particular, but to all in general. The devil works precisely in the same way. He is a very clever fellow, I have no acquaintance with him, but I respect his evident talents. Consistent truth and goodness will assuredly in the end overcome everything, but inconsistent good can never be a match for consistent evil. Alas, I look in vain for some wise and vigorous man to sound the word duty in the ears of this generation.
The devil is a clever fellow until you are wise to his wiles, and then he is a total idiot. But he does know how to bait a hook.
The English public is not yet ripe to comprehend the essential difference between the reason and the understanding, between a principle and a maxim, an eternal truth and a mere conclusion generalized from a great number of facts. A man, having seen 1,000,000 moss roses all red, concludes from his own experience and that of others that all moss roses are red. That is a maxim with him, the greatest amount of his knowledge upon the subject. But it is only true until some gardener has produced a white moss rose, after which the maxim is good for nothing. Again, suppose Adam watching the sun sinking under the western horizon for the first time, he is seized with gloom and terror, relieved by scarce a ray of hope that he shall ever see the glorious light again. The next evening, when it declines, his hopes are stronger, but still mixed with fear, and even at the end of 1,000 years, all that a man can feel is a hope and an expectation so strong as to preclude anxiety.
It seems to me that this is an important difference between religion and science. One deals with eternal truth while the other is based on conclusions generalized from a great number of facts.
I never from a boy could under any circumstances feel the slightest dread of death as such. In all my illnesses I have ever had the most intense desire to be released from this life, unchecked by any but one wish, namely, to be able to finish my work on philosophy. Not that I have any author's vanity on the subject.
A fitting comment to end this group of extracts and something to which we should all aspire. Children do not feel a need to propitiate their loving parents. Real Christians ought not to regard God as needing propitiation. Bruce Charlton. I have often written of the UN Christian, indeed anti-Christian, idea that God needs and demands propitiation. I have also often written about my conviction that the spontaneous and natural spiritual knowledge of young children was built into us by God, for our guidance, and as the basis of that adult knowledge we develop from properly interpreted experiences and, usually, increasing capacity. I was considering my own childhood compulsion to pray. I was aged about 5 to 6 years, and how such prayers were almost entirely propitiatory in nature. I would beg my God, who was, I think, conceptualized as Thor, for the safety and survival of those I loved, and these prayers needed to be specific for each person, were desperate, and were repeated over and over again to the limit of my endurance. These prayers were a ritual, before sleep, needed to avoid the punishment of harm being visited on those I loved. And, although the ritual was done to avert harm, I was very unsure of its effectiveness. Partly this was because of a sense that if I said or did anything wrong, then this would at least negate the prayer, and it might even evoke a punishment for my mistake, such that just what I prayed against would be inflicted as the punishment. This seems to have been a common view of religious ritual through much of history, for example in the European Middle Ages, i.e. that it must be done exactly correctly or else it would do more harm than good. My first thought was to wonder whether this childhood experience of spontaneous propitiatory prayer was a guide to the real nature of God. I wondered if the fact I prayed in this style and spirit without being told, might be evidence that this was the real nature of God and his relationship with us. But then it suddenly struck me that I never felt the same way about my own mother or father. I never felt that my parents wanted, needed or demanded propitiation. Indeed, the idea never even crossed my mind. The reason was obvious. I knew that my parents loved me. And I knew this, it was my solid faith. Therefore, because my parents really loved me and I knew it, propitiation was utterly alien and inappropriate, and indeed would be hurtful to loving parents. The God of whom Jesus speaks is spoken of as his Father and our Father, as the ideal and perfect loving Father. Of course a loving father does not want propitiation, certainly he does not demand propitiation, nor does God our loving Father punish his children for failing to perform sufficient or correct propitiations. Jesus is saying pretty plainly that the real God, the Creator, is our loving Father, and asking us to have the same faith in God's love that a child may have in the love of good parents, as I had in the love of my parents. By talking of and to his loving Father, Jesus is saying that a God who is regarded as wanting, needing, demanding propitiation is a false God, because the real God, the Christian God, the true Creator, is of an absolutely different kind. God is Jesus' actual loving Father, and our actual loving Father, and we should have absolute confidence that he loves us as the ideal and perfect Father. Many, most, perhaps all other religions conceptualize their God or gods in ways that make propitiation of such gods / natural and needful. And there are plenty of beings, including human beings, as well as various spirit beings, including demonic, that do demand propitiation. But these are not who Jesus meant by God. It very often seems to me that many self-identified Christians, and especially those who profess ultra-orthodox or traditionalist convictions, are actually, albeit implicitly, worshipping the God of Judaism, and / or of Islam, rather than the Father of Jesus Christ. What this means is that self-identified Christians who believe that their God requires propitiation are making a very serious error. There are many, many, such Christians, often among the most devout, and always have been. And if they persist in this error of worshipping a propitiation demanding God, and if they, for instance, build their core theology, their articles of faith, around the necessity for propitiation, then the God that such people are advocating is not the same God whom Jesus was addressing. In a nutshell, the Christian God is a loving Father, and Jesus asks us to have the same kind of faith in God's love that a good child has in the love of his parents. Genuine parental love, by man of men, or God of his children, has nothing to do with propitiation. Note, I should clarify that ultimately I personally regard God as a dyad of Heavenly Father and Mother for metaphysical and intuitive reasons explained elsewhere, but my argument applies the same both to God understood as Father only, and to God as heavenly parents. So, I have presented the above argument in traditional language. Good only comes from good motivations, not from the negation of evil. Bruce Charlton. Good only comes from good motivations, not from the negation of evil. This ought to be obvious, but human beings are confused by the scale and abstraction of modern civilization and life, so they mistakenly come to believe that the defeat or destruction of their enemies is evidence of increasing good in the world. It is grasping at straws, when it is not an indirect preparation for self-advertisement. I see a lot of this at present. A lot of commentators crowing over the travails of the most leftist corporations, the most zealously totalitarian nations, etc. Predictions that this presages a turn of the wheel of fortune, that from the self-burned ashes of the West shall, inevitably, it seems, arise the beautiful phoenix of a Christian society. As the self-hating self-destructiveness of modern totalitarian leftism begins to erode social functionality in ever more obvious ways, with the incompetence, decline and collapse of signature evil-tending institutions, it is tempting to suppose this change represents a pendulum swing back towards good. It doesn't, at least, not in the West, and not on any socially significant scale. What is happening, almost always, is that the organized, bureaucratic evil of globalist/leftist totalitarianism is being eaten away from within by the short-term selfishness and/or spiteful destructiveness of its component parts. Yet from a Christian perspective, the infighting of evil is almost irrelevant, because no matter how many evil institutions and persons degrade and impoverish each other, unless there are sufficiently good motivated institutions and persons that will occupy the vacated social spaces, then matters are no further forward, and indeed whatever evil emerges triumphant will be energized and strengthened. Our problem is far deeper than merely being dominated by an evil leadership class, evil government, evil corporations, evil education, and evil mass media, etc. Our profoundest problem is lack of good. Most of those who crow most loudly over the demise of some disfavored grouping or person, are manifestly core-motivated by one or other evil drive, money, sex, status, power, or a cynical sneering sadistic spitefulness/Schadenfreude. Such people do want as primary that which Jesus Christ offered, resurrected eternal heavenly life, even when they have constructed a pseudo-Christian system as their public consumption objective. Yet such people are not necessarily evil, overall, and in net effect, they may simply be the normal, average kind of person with mixed motivations, but who have allowed their base motivations to take first place and determine their core allegiance. Our civilizational problem is that even such people are statistically among the best of us, and they are not good enough. Nothing like good enough. Only those mixed persons, no matter how mixed, whose primary motivation and core allegiance is to God and Jesus Christ will suffice for what is needed here and now, and such persons are, to all appearances, exceedingly rare. In sum, beware the false triumphalism that celebrates evil persons and institutions coming to an evil end for evil reasons. Mix it how we will, a stew of evils can yield only soul poison, unless we discern, reject and repent the whole nasty brew. A sign of false allegiance, a litmus test, if you like, is trying to emulate, to learn from, the effectiveness of heroes and exemplars of evil. Oh, why can't we be more like, fill in the name of some evil success story? In some, advocating adopting the methods of evil, on the basis that these tactics have a strong track record of changing the world, that they work. This is a litmus test of evil allegiance because such people have failed to learn that doing evil and doing good are not symmetrical. Evil is much, much easier than good, because destruction is easier than creation. It requires hard, prolonged and skilled labor to make a functional machine or a beautiful artwork, but any idiot can vandalize them in a moment.